Liesl Brenner, 26 years old, bit into a piece of bread. Her hand trembled, not from fear, not from cold, not from the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like permanent winter. She trembled because she had forgotten that bread could be soft, forgotten that flour could be white, forgotten that food could be something other than survival measured in careful, desperate mouthfuls. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. She weighed 89 pounds. Her body mass index registered at 14.4, a number that meant nothing to her, but everything to the American military physician who had examined her 3 hours earlier. He had written in her medical file in handwriting she would never see: severe malnutrition, risk of cardiac failure, recommend gradual refeeding protocol, monitor closely. But the thing that would truly break Liesl Brenner was not hunger, it was not the war, it was not even the knowledge of what her country had done, though that revelation waited for her like a knife in the darkness, patient and inevitable. The thing that would shatter everything she believed, everything she had sacrificed for, everything she had been told about enemies and deprivation and the noble suffering of the German people. That thing was a chocolate layer cake, and it was coming in 5 weeks. October 19th, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Stonehurst, New Jersey, carrying 54 women who had learned to forget what hunger felt like, because acknowledging hunger made the emptiness worse. Liesl sat near the back, pressed against the cold metal ribbing of the truck bed, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform hanging loose on a frame that had once been sturdy and capable. The olive fabric that had fit properly 18 months ago now draped over her shoulders like a borrowed coat, cinched at the waist with a belt pulled to its tightest notch and still too loose by 2 inches. She was 26 years old. The hollows beneath her cheekbones made her look a decade older. Her eyes, once bright with the certainty of youth, had taken on the flat quality of someone who had stopped expecting anything beyond the next moment of endurance. Around her, the other women maintained the same rigid silence they had kept since their capture in France 3 weeks earlier. No one spoke, no one complained, no one asked where they were going or what would happen next. They had learned, all of them, that questions were dangerous, that hope was more exhausting than despair, that the only way to survive was to exist in the present moment, expecting nothing, wanting nothing, feeling nothing beyond the basic awareness of breath and heartbeat. The truck hit a pothole. Liesl's hip bone, sharp now, prominent in a way it had never been before the war, struck the metal floor. Pain flared, familiar and almost welcome. Pain meant she was still alive. Pain meant her body still had something left to protect, some small reserve of flesh between bone and the hard surfaces of the world. She looked at the women around her, cataloguing faces she had come to know during the journey across the Atlantic. Hildegard Steinhoff sat directly across from her, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that revealed the sharp angles of her face. 28 years old, a nursing assistant from Munich who had served in military hospitals before her capture. Hildegard had not cried since they were taken, not during the initial chaos of capture when French resistance fighters had surrounded their communications unit, not during the interrogations that followed, conducted in broken German by American intelligence officers, not during the processing at the temporary camp in France where they had been photographed and documented like specimens, not during the long Atlantic crossing in the cargo hold of a military transport ship where seasickness and despair had claimed what little dignity remained. Her eyes were fixed on some middle distance that existed only in her mind. Whatever memory or calculation occupied her thoughts, she gave no outward sign. Her face was a mask of professional detachment, the expression of a nurse who had learned to separate herself from the suffering she witnessed. Liesl wondered what it cost her to maintain that mask. She suspected it cost everything. Beside Hildegard sat Renate Vollmer, 24 years old, a military secretary from Stuttgart, with bitten fingernails and raw cuticles that spoke of anxiety turned inward. Renate was the one Liesl watched most carefully. There was something in her face that went beyond the hunger and exhaustion they all shared, something that burned beneath the surface like embers waiting for fuel. Her jaw was perpetually clenched, her hands perpetually fisted, her entire body held in a state of tension that seemed to have nothing to do with their current circumstances. Rage. Liesl recognized it because she had seen it before, in soldiers who had lost something that could never be replaced, in mothers who had buried children, in people for whom grief had curdled into something harder, something that could not be softened by time or circumstance. She did not know Renate's story yet, but she sensed that when it emerged it would be terrible. The truck stopped with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo the exhaustion of everyone inside. Through the canvas opening at the back, Liesl could see the camp spreading out before them in the pale October light. Rows of wooden barracks painted white, standing in neat military formation. Guard towers at regular intervals, manned by soldiers who looked impossibly well fed from this distance. A fence topped with barbed wire, though it looked almost decorative compared to what she had imagined. What struck her first, what struck all of them, she would learn later, was the color, green. The grass was green, not the muddy brown of bombed-out European landscapes churned by tank treads and artillery shells until nothing living remained. Not the grey of cities reduced to rubble, where even weeds struggled to find purchase among the broken stones. Not the sickly yellow-brown of fields, stripped of nutrients by years of intensive farming to feed a war machine that devoured everything. Actual green grass, trimmed and maintained as if someone here had time and resources to care about such things. Liesl had not seen grass like that in years. She stared at it through the canvas opening, and something in her chest constricted painfully. American soldiers moved about the compound with an ease that struck her as almost obscene. Men and women in crisp uniforms, walking without urgency, some of them actually talking to each other, gesturing, nodding. One man threw his head back and laughed at something his companion said, the sound carrying across the distance like a foreign language. Laughing. One of them was laughing. The sound reached Liesl's ears like an artifact from another civilization, another era, another world entirely. She had forgotten that laughter existed outside of bitter irony, outside of the gallows humor that soldiers develop to survive situations too terrible for genuine mirth. This was different. This was casual. This was the laughter of someone who had slept well and eaten recently and expected to do both again tomorrow without question or concern. These soldiers weren't starving. Their uniforms fit properly, not loose and baggy like the clothing of people whose bodies had consumed themselves, but filled out, tailored, appropriate to their frames. Some of them looked well fed in a way that seemed almost fictional, like characters from a story she had been told as a child about a land where food was plentiful and no one went hungry and children grew up with full bellies and rosy cheeks. The propaganda had been clear. America was suffering. The British blockade had crippled their supply lines. The enemy was desperate, rationing everything, on the verge of collapse. German U-boats were sinking their merchant ships faster than they could be built. American factories were struggling to produce enough to sustain their war effort. The civilian population was hungry, demoralized, ready to pressure their government into surrender. That was what Liesl had been told. That was what everyone had been told, in newspapers and radio broadcasts and official pronouncements from the Ministry of Propaganda. Looking at these soldiers now, at their filled-out uniforms and their casual laughter and their complete lack of the hollow-eyed desperation she had come to associate with wartime existence, Liesl felt the first crack form in the foundation of her understanding. Major Constance Whitfield stood waiting as the German women climbed down from the truck. She was tall, 5 feet 10 inches in her regulation shoes, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Her eyes were the color of winter slate, missing nothing, revealing nothing. Her posture was perfect in a way that spoke of decades of military discipline. Her uniform immaculate, despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in this part of New Jersey. She was 42 years old, though she could have passed for either younger or older depending on the light. Around her neck, visible at the collar of her uniform, hung a thin gold chain. Something glinted at its end, tucked beneath the fabric. A ring, perhaps, though its significance was not apparent to the women watching her. She had overseen 3 other POW processing operations since her assignment to Camp Stonehurst 8 months earlier. German soldiers, mostly. Men who arrived sullen and defeated, or defiant and dangerous, or simply broken beyond the point where categories mattered. But this was her first group of female prisoners. The intelligence reports had been sparse and clinical. Wehrmacht Women's Auxiliary Corps members captured during the Allied advance through northern France. Radio operators, clerks, nurses, translators. Non-combatants, technically, though the distinction felt meaningless when the entire continent was ablaze and everyone, combatant or not, had blood on their hands by association. What struck Major Whitfield immediately was not their appearance, though they looked gaunt and exhausted in ways that would require medical attention. It was their eyes. These women looked at the camp with the flat, affectless gaze of people who had stopped expecting anything at all. No hope, no fear, no curiosity about their surroundings or their fate. Just a dull acceptance that whatever came next would be endured, because endurance was all that remained. Major Whitfield had seen that look before, on refugees fleeing the advancing armies in Europe, carrying everything they owned in bundles on their backs. On displaced persons who had lost not just homes but entire identities, entire histories, entire reasons for existing. On soldiers who had witnessed too much death to remember how to live, who moved through the world like ghosts wearing human bodies. But she had never seen it on prisoners who were about to be fed, housed and treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Prisoners who, within the hour, would receive more food than they had probably seen in months. What, she wondered, had these women experienced to produce that 1,000-yard stare? What had Germany done to its own people? The women formed a line without being told. Military discipline ingrained so deeply that it persisted even in captivity, even in exhaustion, even in the complete absence of any authority figure demanding compliance. They stood at attention, or as close to attention as their weakened bodies could manage, eyes forward, waiting for inspection or orders or whatever came next in this incomprehensible new reality. 54 women, arranged in 2 neat rows, silent and still. Private Delmar Hutchins watched them from his position near the processing station. He was 22 years old, lanky and sunburned, with the raw-boned look of someone who had grown up doing physical labor. He came from a small town in Vermont where his family had operated a dairy farm for 4 generations, and he had joined the army in 1942 with vague notions of adventure and service that had since been replaced by a more practical understanding of what war actually meant. He had been assigned to Camp Stonehurst for 7 months. He had processed hundreds of German POWs during that time, men, always men, arriving in various states of physical and psychological damage. Some had been defiant, spitting German curses and promising that the Reich would ultimately triumph. Some had been relieved, almost grateful to be out of the fighting, to have survived long enough to become prisoners. Some had been so badly wounded, physically or mentally, that processing them had felt less like military procedure and more like triage at a hospital for the dying. But watching these women shuffle into formation, Delmar felt something shift in his understanding of what this war had done to people. His younger sister Rebecca was 23 years old, about the same age as many of these prisoners. She lived in Vermont, on the family farm, helping their mother with the dairy operation, while their father and Delmar served overseas. She complained in her letters about rationing, about the difficulty of getting sugar for her famous apple pies, about the tedium of wartime life in a small town where nothing ever happened. Delmar found himself wondering what circumstances would have to exist for Rebecca to look like these women looked. What would have to happen to his sister, to any woman, to any human being, to produce this hollowness, this emptiness, this complete absence of the vitality that should animate a living person? The thought made his stomach turn. He looked away from the formation, focusing on his paperwork, trying not to see his sister's face superimposed on the gaunt features of the prisoners. Major Whitfield stepped forward. The German women tensed collectively, a ripple of apprehension passing through the formation like wind through wheat. Liesl felt her shoulders tighten, her spine straighten despite its exhaustion, her breath catch in her throat. This was the moment. This was when they would discover what kind of enemy they faced, what kind of treatment they could expect, whether the propaganda had been accurate or understated or something else entirely. They had been prepared for cruelty, for humiliation, for the barbaric treatment that Americans supposedly inflicted on their prisoners, because Americans were savage and uncivilized, because they lacked the culture and discipline of the German people, because they were mongrels from a mongrel nation with no respect for the rules of civilized warfare. That was what they had been told. That was what they expected. Major Whitfield opened her mouth and spoke in perfect German. Willkommen in Camp Stonehurst. Sie werden gemäß der Genfer Konvention behandelt. Sie haben nichts zu befürchten. Welcome to Camp Stonehurst. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have nothing to fear. Liesel's breath stopped. Her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. An American officer, the enemy, the barbarian, the uncivilized savage from across the ocean, speaking German. Not broken phrases learned from a military phrasebook, butchered by an untrained tongue. Not accented words that revealed the speaker's foreignness with every syllable. Perfect German, educated German. The German of someone who had studied the language seriously at a university perhaps, who understood its nuances and rhythms, who respected it enough to learn it properly and speak it with something approaching fluency. This was not what Liesl had been prepared for. This was not what any of them had been prepared for. She glanced at Hildegard, standing beside her in the formation. The nurse's face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the beginning of something more dangerous. Doubt. Major Whitfield continued, her tone professional but not unkind. You will be processed today. Medical examinations first, then documentation, then assignment to quarters. You will receive meals at regular intervals. You will not be harmed, questioned excessively, or punished without cause. She paused, letting the words settle over the silent formation. I understand that you may not believe me. I understand that you have been told many things about Americans that do not match what you are seeing here. That is your prerogative. Belief cannot be commanded. Her grey eyes swept across the formation, meeting each woman's gaze briefly. But my actions will speak louder than my words. In time you will see the truth for yourselves. Until then, I ask only that you follow camp regulations and conduct yourselves with the discipline your service has trained into you. She turned to Private Hutchins. Begin processing. The processing took 2 hours. Names recorded in neat columns on official forms, personal effects catalogued, watches, jewelry, photographs, letters, placed in labelled envelopes with promises of safekeeping. Medical examinations completed in a building that smelled of antiseptic and efficiency. The American doctors were thorough but clinical, examining each woman with professional detachment. They noted weights and heights and symptoms of malnutrition, with the same systematic approach they might use for inventory, recording numbers that would become part of official records, evidence of conditions that would later be studied by military historians. Liesl stood on the scale, 89 pounds. The doctor, a captain with tired eyes and gentle hands, a wedding ring on his finger, and photographs of children visible on his desk, made a note on her chart. He did not comment on the number. He did not express shock or pity or any of the emotions that might have made the moment feel more human. He simply wrote it down and moved on to the next measurement. But Liesl saw his jaw tighten. She saw the way his pen hesitated just for a moment before making the notation. She understood, without being told, that 89 pounds was not a number he had expected to write, that whatever his experience with POWs, whatever his preparation for this assignment, her weight had surprised him, and not in a good way. Private Hutchins helped process the documentation. He asked questions in halting German, name, rank, unit, date of capture, while filling out forms that seemed endless, bureaucratic, almost comically mundane given the circumstances. When he reached Renate Vollmer, he noticed her hands. The bitten nails chewed down past the quick until the flesh was raw and exposed. The cuticles torn and bleeding in places, worried by anxious fingers that could not stay still. The way her hands twitched constantly, reaching for something that wasn't there, or perhaps pushing away something that was. He asked her name. She answered in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, flat as the Nebraska plains he had crossed on a train once, empty as the sky above them. Vollmer, Renate, Gefreiter, 7th Army Headquarters, Administrative Section. Her eyes met his for just a moment. In that moment, Delmar Hutchins saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not hatred, not fear. Not the defiance or despair he had seen in other prisoners, rage, a cold, compressed fury that had nothing to do with him personally, nothing to do with the Americans or the camp or the processing, something older than her capture, something that had been building for years, perhaps, fed by losses he could not imagine. He looked away first, finished her paperwork with hands that were not quite steady, moved on to the next prisoner. But he would remember Renate Vollmer's eyes, the fury that lived there, banked and patient, waiting for fuel. He hoped he would never see what happened when that fury finally found its target. Major Whitfield led them to the mess hall for their first meal as official prisoners of war. The women walked in formation, 2 lines, evenly spaced, steps synchronized out of habit rather than conscious decision. Military discipline, automatic and enduring, a structure to hold on to when everything else had collapsed. They had been soldiers, after all, or something like soldiers. They had served the Reich in their various capacities, doing work that men could not or would not do, freeing male soldiers for combat by taking over administrative and support functions. They had worn the uniform and followed orders, and believed, most of them, that they were contributing to something larger than themselves. Now they were simply prisoners, walking across an American military compound, approaching a building that smelled of food. The smell hit them before they reached the door. Coffee, real coffee, dark and rich, the unmistakable aroma that Liesl had not experienced since 1942, not the ersatz substitute made from roasted acorns and chicory and burnt grain that had become standard in Germany as the real supply dwindled to nothing, not the bitter, unsatisfying imitation that everyone pretended was acceptable because complaining was unpatriotic. Real coffee. The smell bypassed every defense Liesl had constructed, every mechanism she had developed for not wanting things she couldn't have, every wall she had built between herself and her body's desperate needs. Her mouth watered, her stomach cramped. Her hands began to shake with a tremor she could not control. Behind the coffee came other scents, layering one atop another like instruments joining an orchestra. Bread. Fresh bread, still warm, with the yeasty richness of proper rising. Meat. Actual meat, not the watery soup made from bones and gristle that passed for protein in German military rations. Something sweet, something impossible, something that could not exist in a world at war. And then they entered the mess hall, and everything stopped. The tables were laid out with white bread. White bread, not the dark, heavy loaves that had become standard in Germany as the wheat shortages progressed. Not the bread mixed with sawdust and potato starch and ground chestnuts and whatever other fillers the bakers could find to stretch the diminishing flour supply. Not the bread that sat in your stomach like a stone and gave you just enough nutrition to keep working, but never enough to feel satisfied. White bread, soft and pale and impossibly present, sliced and arranged on plates as if this were an ordinary day in an ordinary place where such abundance was unremarkable. Beside the bread sat small pads of butter, real butter, yellow and glistening with the unmistakable sheen of actual dairy fat. Not the Ersatzfett made from coal tar derivatives that German chemists had developed as a substitute, the synthetic spread that looked like butter but tasted like petroleum and sat in your gut like a stone. Real butter, churned from real cream, produced by real cows, transported to this mess hall and placed on these plates as if butter was simply available, simply present, simply part of what a meal contained. There was cheese, actual cheese, pale and firm, sliced thin. There was canned meat, opened and arranged on serving platters. There was coffee in large urns, steam rising, the smell filling the entire room like a benediction. And there were dishes and utensils set out at each place, as if someone expected them to sit down and eat like civilized people, like guests rather than prisoners, like human beings who deserved more than the minimum required to keep them alive. 54 women stood at the entrance to the mess hall. None of them moved, none of them spoke. None of them could process what their eyes were showing them. This was not possible, this was not real. This was some kind of trick, some elaborate deception, some psychological manipulation designed to confuse them before the real treatment began, because this could not be what American prisoners received. This could not be ordinary. This could not be true. Major Whitfield watched their faces. She had witnessed many reactions from prisoners receiving their first American meal over her months at Camp Stonehurst. Relief was common, the visible relaxation of men who had feared starvation or torture and found instead adequate provisions. Gratitude appeared occasionally, expressed in awkward words or simple nods of acknowledgement. Suspicion was frequent. Many prisoners assumed the food was poisoned, or that this abundance was temporary, a manipulation designed to elicit information before rations would be reduced to something more punishing. They ate cautiously, watching for signs of betrayal, waiting for the trap to spring. But Major Whitfield had never seen this, a collective paralysis so complete that 54 women simply stood at the entrance, frozen, staring at bread and butter as if they were artifacts from a lost civilization, as if they were hallucinating, as if the world had suddenly revealed itself to be operating under rules they had never been taught. Hildegard Steinhoff moved first. She stepped forward slowly, her nursing training overriding her shock. She approached the nearest table with the caution of someone approaching an unexploded ordnance, each step deliberate, her eyes fixed on the food as if it might transform into something else if she looked away. Her hand reached out. Trembling, her fingers made contact with the butter. She jerked back as if burned, a small cry escaping her lips, the first sound any of them had made since entering the building. Then she touched the butter again, pressed her finger into it, watched the small indentation form, the yellow fat yielding to pressure, behaving exactly as real butter should behave. She lifted her finger to her nose, inhaled. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, cracked and broken by something that might have been wonder or might have been grief. Gott im Himmel, es ist echte Butter. God in heaven, it is real butter. The words broke something in the room. Several women began to cry, silent tears streaming down faces that had forgotten how to express emotion. Others moved toward the tables with the hesitant steps of sleepwalkers, reaching out to touch the bread, the cheese, the impossible abundance laid out before them. But not everyone moved forward. Renata Volmer remained at the entrance, her body rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her eyes swept the room with something that looked like calculation, like threat assessment, like the cold analysis of someone who had learned through bitter experience that kindness was often the most dangerous trap of all. Her voice cut through the quiet sounds of wonder and weeping. "This is a trick." German words, sharp and clear, meant for all of them to hear. "They will poison us, or they will use this food to make us talk. They will feed us today and starve us tomorrow, once they have what they want from us." Several women stopped their movement toward the tables. This made sense to them. This fit the narrative they had been taught, the understanding of enemies they had carried across the ocean in their minds. But others were already sitting down, drawn by hunger that overpowered reason, reaching for bread and butter with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. Liesel stood between the two groups, literally and figuratively. She looked at the food, the white bread that her mother used to make before the rationing began, before everything changed. She looked at Renate, whose rage made a terrible kind of sense. She looked at Major Whitfield, standing near the doorway, watching everything with those winter-grey eyes that seemed to see too much. Her stomach cramped with a hunger that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. Her mind screamed warnings, echoing Renate's words. Trap, poison, manipulation. The enemy is not kind. The enemy does not give gifts without expecting payment. But her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and picked up a slice of white bread. The first bite. Liesel had prepared herself for many things during the long journey to this moment. Capture, interrogation, physical hardship, the uncertainty of being a prisoner in a foreign land where she did not speak the language and did not know the rules. She had not prepared herself for this. The bread was soft, so soft that her teeth sank through it with almost no resistance, releasing a flavor she had not tasted in 3 years. Wheat, pure wheat, ground fine and risen properly and baked with care by someone who had enough flour to bake it right. The taste exploded across her tongue, carrying with it a flood of memory so powerful that her eyes closed involuntarily, overwhelmed. Her mother's kitchen in Frankfurt. 1941, before the rationing became severe. The smell of fresh bread cooling on the counter. The warmth of the oven lingering in the small room. Her mother's hands dusted with flour, reaching out to tear off a piece of the still warm loaf. Iss Liesel, es ist genug für alle. Eat Liesel, there is enough for everyone. Those words. That casual assumption of plenty. The world before scarcity became the only reality anyone knew. Liesel's eyes filled with tears. She stood in an American mess hall, a prisoner of war, weeping over a piece of bread. Around her, other women were experiencing their own moments of collapse. Hildegard sat at a table, eating butter directly from the small pad with her fingers, tears streaming unacknowledged down her face. Older women held bread to their noses, inhaling deeply, their eyes closed, lost in memories that the smell had unlocked. Younger women ate mechanically, desperately, shoveling food into their mouths as if it might disappear at any moment, as if they had to consume as much as possible before the dream ended and reality reasserted itself. And Renata Volmer still stood at the entrance, watching it all, with eyes that burned. Major Whitfield stepped forward. She spoke in German, her voice cutting through the sounds of weeping and eating. "Please sit. This is your meal. No one will take it from you. There will be more food tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that you are here." She paused. "I know this is difficult to believe. I know this is not what you expected, but I am telling you the truth, and in time, you will see that for yourselves." The words were meant to be comforting. Instead, they landed like blows. No one will take it from you. There will be more tomorrow. Simple statements that implied a world Liesel had forgotten existed, a world where food was reliable, a world where tomorrow's meal was not a desperate uncertainty, a world where prisoners, enemies, captives, the defeated, were fed like this. Liesel sat down at a table. She ate slowly, reverently, forcing herself not to devour everything in sight, despite the screaming hunger that demanded more faster now. She ate bread with butter, feeling the fat melt on her tongue. She drank coffee with real cream, the richness of it almost unbearable after years of thin, bitter substitutes. She watched Renate finally sit down, finally reach for food, finally eat, though her face remained hard, her movements mechanical, her eyes never losing that calculating wariness. And she thought about what this meal meant. If the Americans had white bread, real white bread, made with real flour, then the supply lines were not disrupted, the blockades had not worked. The propaganda about American deprivation had been lies. The first crack in her understanding had become a fracture. By the end of this meal, it would be a chasm. Later that night, the women lay in their bunks in Barrack 7. The building was simple but clean. Wooden frames with thin mattresses covered in rough blankets, a wood stove in the corner providing heat against the October chill. Better than the transport ship. Better than the temporary processing camp in France. Better, if they were being honest with themselves, than many of the quarters they had occupied during their service. The lights were out, but no one was sleeping. Liesel stared at the ceiling she could not see, her mind churning through calculations that refused to add up. The bread had been white, the butter had been real, the coffee had been actual coffee, not ersatz, not substitute, not the bitter compromise that everyone in Germany had learned to accept. If the Americans had these things, if they had them in sufficient quantity to feed prisoners, to feed enemy women captured in combat operations, then everything Liesel had been told about American deprivation was false. Not exaggerated, not slightly optimistic. False. Completely, utterly, demonstrably false. She thought about the ration cards at home. The endless queues for basic supplies, sometimes lasting hours for a single loaf of bread. The bread itself growing darker and heavier as the war progressed, as wheat became scarce, as sawdust and chestnuts and potato starch were mixed into the flour to stretch supplies that could not be stretched enough. She thought about the mothers with children trying to make inadequate portions seem like adequate meals. The tricks with water and salt and whatever vegetables could be scrounged. The hollow eyes of children who had never known anything but hunger. She thought about the workers in factories running on calories that barely sustained consciousness, expected to produce tanks and guns and ammunition while their bodies slowly consumed themselves. The German people had suffered. Liesel knew this. She had lived it. She had watched it happen to everyone she knew. But they had been told the suffering was shared, that the enemy was equally deprived, that American soldiers were living on bread and water, that American factories were running out of materials, that American morale was crumbling under the weight of shortages they could not overcome. The white bread on her plate had put the lie to all of it. A voice came from the darkness, Renate, 3 bunks away, speaking into the silence that was not silence. I had a sister. The words fell like stones into still water. Greta, she was 6 years old. Liesel heard the other women holding their breath, sensing that something important was about to be said. When the rationing started, we thought it was temporary, a few months, maybe a year. The government told us the war would be short. They told us victory was certain. They told us to sacrifice now so we could celebrate later. Renate's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone reciting facts that had been repeated so many times they no longer carried feeling. The rationing got worse. The bread got darker. The portions got smaller. Greta started losing weight. She was a thin child anyway, always small for her age, and she didn't have any reserves to lose. A long pause, the sound of breathing in the darkness. By 1943, she weighed 31 pounds. She was 6 years old, and she weighed 31 pounds. Liesl closed her eyes, though it made no difference in the lightless barracks. The doctor said it was malnutrition, but that's just a medical word for what really happened. My mother called it what it was, das Hunger. The hunger. My sister died because there wasn't enough food, because the rations kept shrinking, and the bread kept getting darker and the soup kept getting thinner until there was nothing left to keep a child's body alive. The silence after Renate's words stretched like a wire pulled taut. Then her voice came again, harder now, the rage beginning to show through the flat recitation. They told us everyone was suffering. They told us the British were starving, the Americans were starving. Everyone in the world was starving together because of this war. They told us our sacrifice was noble, that we were all in this together, that victory would come if we just held on a little longer. A sound that might have been a laugh, if laughter could be made of broken glass. And then I came here, and I saw the butter, real butter, and the bread. White bread, the kind I haven't seen since I was Greta's age. And I understood. Her voice cracked on the last word. They lied. They lied about everything. While our children were dying, while my sister was starving to death, while German mothers were trading wedding rings for potatoes, they had this. The enemy had white bread and real butter. The enemy had chocolate, Liesl. Chocolate. I saw it in the kitchen when they were cleaning up. The words hung in the air. Greta never tasted chocolate. She died without ever tasting chocolate, and they have it here, for prisoners. No one spoke for a long time. The wood stove crackled. The October wind moved through trees that were dropping their leaves outside. Somewhere in the distance, an American soldier laughed, that casual sound again, that unbearable evidence of a world where laughter was still possible. Hildegard's voice came from the darkness, barely audible. If they lied about the food, what else did they lie about? The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered, because they all knew deep in their bones that once you started pulling at one thread of deception, the entire fabric began to unravel. If the government had lied about American scarcity, what about American cruelty? What about the righteousness of Germany's cause? What about the necessity of the war itself? What about the things that happened in the East, the rumors that everyone heard but no one discussed, the stories about camps and disappearances that were quickly silenced whenever they surfaced? Liesl lay in the darkness, feeling the ground shift beneath her understanding. She thought about her mother, still in Frankfurt if the city still stood. Her father, location unknown, last communication from the Eastern Front 8 months ago. Her younger brother, Hans, 17 years old now, conscripted into what remained of the defense forces. What were they eating tonight? Dark bread, if they were lucky. Turnip soup, watered down to stretch the portions, perhaps a small potato, carefully divided among whoever remained. While she lay here, in an American camp, with a full stomach for the first time in years, the guilt was overwhelming. But beneath the guilt was something worse. The growing terrible suspicion that her suffering, her family's suffering, the suffering of an entire nation, had not been noble sacrifice for a shared cause. It had simply been suffering, unnecessary, preventable, inflicted by their own government while the enemy thrived. She turned on her side, facing the wall she could not see. She thought about the chocolate Renate had mentioned. Chocolate? She had not tasted chocolate since 1941, had not seen it since 1942, had trained herself to stop wanting it because wanting things you could not have was a form of torture, and the Americans had it for prisoners. She did not know that in 5 weeks she would taste that chocolate. She did not know that when she did, it would change everything. But lying in the darkness, her stomach full for the first time in years, She already knew that something fundamental had shifted. The first crack had become a fracture, and fractures, once started, tend to spread. 3 weeks passed at Camp Stonehurst, 3 weeks of white bread and real butter, 3 weeks of coffee with cream and meat that came from actual animals, 3 weeks of meals that arrived on schedule, predictable as clockwork, abundant beyond anything these women had experienced since before the war, consumed everything. Liesl Brenner gained 11 pounds. The American doctors tracked her progress on charts she never saw, noting the gradual return of color to her cheeks, the slight softening of the sharp angles that had defined her face. Her body mass index crept upward from 14.4 to 16.1, still dangerously underweight, but no longer in immediate danger of cardiac failure. She did not feel the physical change. What she felt was something else entirely. Every meal was evidence. Every slice of bread was testimony. Every pat of butter was proof that the propaganda had lied. The realization sat in her chest like a weight she could not shift, pressing down on everything she thought she knew about the world. Bridget Callahan had been cooking for the United States Army for 3 years. Ever since her husband Patrick shipped out to the Pacific in early 1942, ever since she found herself alone in their small house in Boston with nothing but time and a desperate need to contribute something more than waiting. She had walked into the Army recruitment office on a Tuesday morning in March, a 42-year-old woman with work-roughened hands and a practical outlook on life, and had asked what she could do to help. They had tested her cooking. They had hired her on the spot. Now she was 45, assigned to Camp Stonehurst for the past 14 months, running the kitchen with an efficiency that had earned her 2 commendations and a reputation for making military rations taste almost like actual food. She was not a remarkable woman by most measures. She had no advanced education, no special training, no credentials beyond a lifetime of feeding people on whatever was available. But she had something that could not be taught. She understood hunger. Her grandmother had survived the Great Famine in Ireland. Bridget had grown up with the stories told in her grandmother's small apartment in South Boston, where the old woman lived out her final years, surrounded by family who had never known what starvation truly meant. "We ate grass, Bridget," her grandmother had said, her eyes distant, seeing fields that existed only in memory. "We ate bark from the trees. We ate things I cannot name in front of children, and still it was not enough. The hunger ate us from the inside while we tried to eat anything at all." The old woman's hands, gnarled with age and labor, would tremble when she spoke of those years. 1 million dead, maybe more. They stopped counting in the end. There were too many to count. Bridget had been 12 years old when her grandmother told her the worst part. "The forgetting was terrible. I forgot what bread tasted like. I forgot what butter was. I forgot that food could be something other than pain in your belly and dreams that made waking worse than sleeping." The old woman had gripped Bridget's hands with surprising strength. "That forgetting changes you, child. Even when the food comes back, even when the famine ends, something in you is always waiting for it to happen again. You never trust plenty. You never believe it will last." Bridget had carried those words with her for 33 years. She had never forgotten them. She first noticed the German women during their second week at camp. Noticed the way they approached the mess hall, cautious, scanning for threats, bodies tensed as if ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Noticed the way they touched food before eating it, as if confirming its reality, as if expecting it to dissolve like a mirage. Noticed how some of them still portioned their meals, setting aside small amounts to hide in pockets or under mattresses, unable to trust that tomorrow's food would actually arrive. These were not the behaviors of prisoners receiving adequate nutrition. These were the behaviors of people who had been starving. Actually starving, not the mild discomfort that Americans called hunger when dinner was an hour late. Bridget recognized those behaviors because her grandmother had described them exactly. The hiding of food, the inability to believe in plenty, the constant calculation of how long supplies might last, even when supplies were abundant. You never trust it, Bridget. Even when the table is full, part of you is always counting, always wondering, always waiting for it to be taken away. Thanksgiving was approaching. The American holiday meant something different to Bridget than it did to most people. Her family had celebrated it, of course. They were Americans now, had been for 3 generations, and they observed American customs with the enthusiasm of immigrants determined to belong. But for Bridget, Thanksgiving had always carried a specific meaning, a celebration of abundance, a deliberate acknowledgement that there was enough. A feast designed to prove that the hunger was over, that the new world had kept its promises, that her grandmother's suffering had purchased something worth having. She found herself thinking about those German women as she planned the Thanksgiving menu, about the way they had stared at white bread as if witnessing a miracle, about the trembling hands and silent tears, and the woman, Renate she thought the name was, who had refused to eat for the first 3 days, convinced the food was poisoned or a trap. About her grandmother's words, echoing across decades. The forgetting changes you. The decision came to her on a Tuesday morning, early November, while she reviewed supply requisitions in the small office behind the kitchen. Chocolate cake. She would make chocolate layer cake for the German prisoners. Not because it was required, not because anyone had ordered it, not because it made military sense or served any strategic purpose, but because her grandmother had spoken of forgetting what sugar tasted like, and Bridget had seen that forgetting in 54 pairs of eyes. Major Constance Whitfield looked up from her paperwork when Bridget appeared in the doorway of her office. "Mrs. Callahan." The Major's voice was neutral, professional. "What can I do for you?" Bridget stepped inside, wiping her hands on her apron from habit, though they were already clean. She stood straight, meeting the Major's grey eyes with a directness that some officers found uncomfortable. "I'd like permission to make chocolate layer cake for the Thanksgiving meal, ma'am, for the German prisoners." Silence. Major Whitfield set down her pen. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, curiosity perhaps, or the assessment of a request that did not fit expected patterns. "Chocolate cake," she repeated. "For the prisoners?" "Yes, ma'am, 3 cakes. Enough for all of them to have a proper slice." "May I ask why?" Bridget had prepared for this question, had rehearsed answers during the walk from the kitchen to the administrative building, phrases that sounded reasonable and justified. But standing here now, facing those winter grey eyes, the prepared words seemed inadequate. She spoke from somewhere deeper. "I've been watching them eat, ma'am, the way they handle food, the way they look at bread like it's made of gold. These women have been starving, not hungry, not underfed, starving, and something in me believes they need to remember what sweetness tastes like." She paused. "My grandmother survived the Irish famine. She used to tell me about forgetting, about how the hunger didn't just take food, it took the memory of food. She said that forgetting changed people in ways that never healed." Bridget's voice steadied. "Those women out there have that same look, the same forgetting in their eyes, and I believe, that remembering sweetness might help them, might start to heal something that starvation broke." Major Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached up and drew the thin gold chain from beneath her uniform collar, revealing what hung at its end, a wedding ring. Simple gold band, worn smooth by years of wearing, too large to fit any of the Major's own fingers. "This belonged to my brother Michael." The words were quiet, controlled, but something lived beneath the surface. "He was killed at Normandy, June 6, 1944. D-Day. A German machine gun position, according to the after-action report. He was 29 years old." Bridget felt her breath catch. His wife, sent me the ring after she received the telegram. She said she couldn't bear to look at it, but she couldn't bear to throw it away either. So she sent it to me, and I've worn it every day since." Major Whitfield turned the ring in her fingers, watching light catch on the worn gold. "Michael was my baby brother. I taught him to ride a bicycle when he was 6. I helped him with his mathematics homework when he was 12. I danced at his wedding 3 years ago, and I thought I would dance at his children's christenings." She looked up at Bridget. "I have every reason to hate those women, Mrs. Callahan. Every reason to want them to suffer. They served the country that killed my brother. They wore the uniform of the army that put a bullet in his heart." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes were bright. "And I have spent the past 5 months asking myself what Michael would want me to do with that hatred, whether he would want me to pass it on, to make other people suffer because he suffered, to become the kind of person who sees enemies instead of human beings." She tucked the ring back beneath her collar. "I don't think he would. I think Michael would tell me that kindness is not weakness, and that treating prisoners humanely doesn't dishonor the soldiers who died fighting them. I think he would say that becoming cruel doesn't bring anyone back. It just creates more cruelty in the world." She straightened the papers on her desk, composing herself. "Make your chocolate cake, Mrs. Callahan. Make 3 of them. Give those women something to remember besides hunger and loss." Bridget nodded, not trusting her voice. She had reached the doorway when Major Whitfield spoke again. "Mrs. Callahan," she turned. "Michael loved chocolate cake. It was his favorite ever since we were children. Our mother made it for every birthday, every celebration. He always asked for extra frosting." A pause. "I think he would approve of this. I think, somehow, this is exactly what he would want." Liesl requested kitchen duty on a cold Wednesday morning in early November. She told herself the reasons were practical. Working in the kitchen meant warmth when the barracks were cold. It meant activity when the empty hours of captivity stretched like endless grey fabric. It meant something that felt like purpose in days that otherwise contained nothing but waiting. But the real reason was simpler. She wanted to see, she wanted to understand how this abundance was possible. She wanted to measure with her own eyes the supplies that produced the meals she had been eating, to quantify the impossible reality that her mind still struggled to accept. The request was approved. 5 women total were assigned to assist Mrs. Callahan in the kitchen, Liesl, Hildegard, and 3 others whose names were still becoming familiar. They arrived each morning at 5 o'clock before the sun rose and worked until the evening meal was served. It was the closest thing to normal that any of them had experienced since capture. The storage room changed everything. Bridget led them there on their 3rd day of kitchen duty, needing extra hands to move supplies for the Thanksgiving preparations. The room was cool and dim, lined with metal shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, organized with military precision. Liesl stopped in the doorway. Flour. 50-pound sacks of flour, white canvas with black stenciled letters, stacked 3 high along an entire wall. More sacks behind those, visible in the shadows, a small mountain of flour, white and pure. She counted, 12 sacks visible. Perhaps more behind them, 600 pounds of flour, at minimum. Her voice came out as a whisper, in German, before she remembered to translate. "So much. This is all for the camp." Bridget paused, a container of baking powder in her hands, and looked at the flour as if seeing it for the first time. This is about 2 weeks' supply, maybe 3. We go through 5 or 6 sacks a week, sometimes more if I'm doing a lot of baking. 2 weeks. Liesl's mind performed calculations she did not want to make. In Germany, by 1944, the civilian flour ration had dropped to approximately 200 grams per person per day, less than half a pound. And that flour was not pure wheat, it was mixed with potato starch, with rye, with sawdust in some cases, with whatever fillers could stretch the supply. What she was looking at in this single storage room in a single American prisoner of war camp represented more pure wheat flour than her entire neighborhood in Frankfurt would receive in 6 months. Perhaps longer, perhaps much longer. Bridget opened a large container and scooped sugar into a measuring cup. White sugar, granulated, pure. The crystals caught the dim light and sparkled like snow. Hildegard made a sound beside Liesel, a small, wounded noise that seemed to escape without her permission. "Sucker," she whispered. "So viel sucker." So much sugar. Bridget glanced at them, understanding the tone if not the words. "We're rationed too back home," she said. "Sugar's been hard to come by since 42. About £0.5 per person per week, they say, though it's not always easy to find even that. £0.5 per week." Liesel translated for Hildegard, watching her friend's face go pale. In Germany, by 1943, the civilian sugar ration had dropped to less than 2 ounces per person per month. By 1944, sugar had essentially vanished from civilian life entirely. What little remained was reserved for military use, for hospitals, for purposes deemed essential by the government. 2 ounces per month versus £0.5 per week. The mathematics were staggering. What Americans considered wartime hardship, £0.5 of sugar per week, was approximately 8 times what German civilians received. 8 times. And that was the restricted ration, the sacrifice Americans were asked to make for the war effort. Liesel gripped the edge of a shelf, steadying herself against numbers that threatened to knock her to the ground. "In Germany," she said slowly, struggling to find English words for concepts that felt too large for any language, "we were told America was starving, that the blockades worked, that your supplies were erschöpft, depleted." Bridget set down the sugar and turned to face her fully. "And you believed it." "We had no reason not to believe. We were hungry, so we thought the enemy must be hungry too. We were sacrificing, so we thought everyone was sacrificing." Liesel's voice cracked. "That is what we were told. That is what everyone was told." Bridget was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. Then she said, "Let me show you something." She led them to a small office behind the main kitchen, where supply records were kept in thick ledgers. "I'm probably not supposed to show you this," Bridget said, pulling out a heavy book, "but I think you need to see it." She opened to a page dense with numbers, columns of figures in neat handwriting. "This is what we ordered last month, just for this camp, just for Camp Stonehurst, about 200 soldiers and 60 prisoners. Liesel looked at the numbers. Flour, 3,200 pounds. Sugar, 850 pounds. Butter, 420 pounds. Meat, 1,400 pounds. Coffee, 180 pounds. Vegetables, listed by type, each in hundreds of pounds. 1 month, 1 camp. "How many camps are there?" she heard herself ask. "POW camps in America?" Bridget shrugged. "Several hundred, I think. Maybe 500 total, counting all the branch camps. I don't know the exact number." 500 camps, each consuming supplies at roughly this rate, while German children died of hunger, while Renate's sister starved to death at 6 years old, while the government told everyone that the enemy was suffering just as much, that the sacrifices were shared, that victory would come if they just held on a little longer. Hildegard pointed at a line item in the ledger, her finger trembling. "Chocolate, 50 pounds. "Chocolade?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Bridget nodded. "For baking, mostly, and hot cocoa for the officers when the weather turns cold." 50 pounds of chocolate, for 1 camp, for 1 month. Liesel thought of children in Germany who had never tasted chocolate, who had been born during the war and would not know what sweetness meant until the war ended. If it ended, if they survived, if there was anything left to survive for. She thought of Renate's sister Greta, who had died at 6 years old without ever tasting chocolate. And here it was, £50 per month for baking and hot cocoa. That night, back in the barracks, Liesl told the others what she had seen: the flour, the sugar, the supply ledger with its impossible numbers. Renate listened without expression, her face a mask of something that had gone beyond rage into a colder, harder territory. When Liesl finished describing the £50 of chocolate, Renate spoke. "I want you to remember this. All of you." Her voice was quiet, controlled. "I want you to remember what we just learned. I want you to think about everyone we know who is hungry right now, tonight, in Germany. Everyone who has buried a child. Everyone who has traded everything they own for a piece of bread." She stood, moving to the window, looking out at the American camp with its electric lights and its well-fed guards, and its abundance that defied everything they had been taught. They lied to us, our government lied to us. While we were starving, while our children were dying, while we were told that everyone was suffering together, the enemy had £50 of chocolate for baking. She turned back to face them. "Remember this. Remember it always. And when someone asks you what you learned in this camp, tell them the truth. We learned that everything we believed was a lie." November the 23rd, 1944. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear, the sky above Camp Stonehurst pale and cloudless. Bridget Callahan had been awake since 3 in the morning. The 3 chocolate cakes sat on the counter in the kitchen, cooling, each one a small masterpiece of effort and intention. 3 layers of deep chocolate sponge made with real cocoa powder and real eggs and real butter. Frosting whipped to perfect consistency, dark and glossy, applied in generous swirls that hid the seams between layers. She had used 14 eggs for the 3 cakes, 3 cups of sugar, 2 pounds of butter, a full pound of chocolate melted carefully over a double boiler. She had used more chocolate in these 3 cakes than a German family would see in 5 years, if they saw any at all. She had done it deliberately, not as cruelty, not as demonstration, not as victory rubbed in the faces of the defeated, but as medicine, because her grandmother had told her what it meant to forget sweetness. And she had seen that forgetting in 54 pairs of eyes. The mess hall had been transformed. White tablecloths covered the usual bare tables, borrowed from the officers' quarters, pressed and laid with care. Autumn decorations adorned the walls, paper leaves in orange and gold, arrangements of pine cones and dried corn. The American soldiers had contributed what they could, creating an atmosphere that was not quite festive, but was clearly deliberate, clearly meant to mark this day as different. The German women filed in at their usual time, maintaining the formation that had become habit. They stopped inside the doorway. The tables were loaded with food. Turkey, actual roasted turkey, golden-skinned and glistening, carved and arranged on platters that lined the center of each table. The smell filled the room, rich, fatty, impossibly luxurious. Mashed potatoes, piled in serving bowls, each peak topped with melting butter that ran down the white slopes like golden rivers. Gravy boats filled with dark, rich sauce. Green beans glistening with butter and flecked with something that might have been almonds. Bread rolls, still warm from the oven, their tops golden brown and slightly cracked. Cranberry sauce in glass bowls, deep red, jewel-like. More food on these tables than these women had seen in one place since before the war. More food than their families in Germany would see in a month, perhaps 2 months, perhaps longer. Liesl stood frozen, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her. This was not a meal, this was a statement, a declaration that abundance existed, that plenty was possible, that somewhere in the world there were people who ate like this, not as a rare celebration, but as a holiday tradition that came every year, reliable as seasons. She thought of her mother, who was probably at this moment trying to stretch a turnip and a handful of grain into something that resembled dinner. She thought of her brother Hans, 17 years old, conscripted into a collapsing army that probably couldn't feed its soldiers any better than it fed its civilians. She thought of all the Thanksgiving meals this camp must have served in previous years, all the abundance that had existed while Germany slowly starved. And she understood, finally and completely, that the war had been lost before it was ever won. Germany had been fighting an enemy that could afford chocolate for baking. How could they ever have hoped to win? Major Whitfield stood at the head of the room, her grey eyes sweeping across the frozen formation of German women. She spoke in German, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. Today is Thanksgiving. It is a day when Americans gather to share a meal and give thanks for what they have. She paused. You are prisoners in this camp, but you are also human beings, and on this day we share what we have. Simple words. Devastating words. We share what we have. What they had was more than Germany had seen in years. The women sat. They ate. Slowly at first, overwhelmed by the abundance, touching food that seemed too precious to consume. Then faster, as hunger overrode reverence, as bodies that had been deprived for years responded to nourishment with desperate urgency. Liesel ate turkey for the first time since 1940. The meat was tender, rich with fat, nothing like the thin soup and gristly scraps that had passed for protein in Germany. Each bite released flavor that her body had forgotten could exist. She ate mashed potatoes with butter, real butter, yellow and rich, and felt tears prick her eyes at the simple pleasure of it. She ate bread rolls that were soft and warm, nothing like the dark, heavy loaves that had become standard at home. Around her, other women were having similar experiences. Some ate with silent tears streaming down their faces. Some ate mechanically, methodically, as if completing a task rather than enjoying a meal. Some stopped frequently, overwhelmed, unable to continue. And Renate ate with her eyes fixed on her plate, her face expressionless, refusing to show anything at all. Then, Bridget Callahan emerged from the kitchen. She carried the first cake on a white serving platter, holding it before her like an offering to gods who might or might not accept. 3 layers of chocolate, dark, glossy frosting, a small miracle of ingredients that should not exist in a world at war. Behind her, 2 kitchen assistants carried the other 2 cakes. They placed them on the center table where everyone could see. The sound in the mess hall changed. It had been quiet before, the subdued sounds of eating, of silverware against plates, of breathing and swallowing and the small noises that accompanied a meal. Now it became silent, completely, absolutely silent. 54 German women stared at 3 chocolate layer cakes. Liesel felt her heart stop. Chocolate? She had not seen chocolate since 1942. Had not tasted it since 1941, had trained herself to stop wanting it, to stop thinking about it, to excise the memory of sweetness from her mind, because that memory was a form of torture when sweetness no longer existed. And here it was, 3 cakes, enough for everyone. In an American prisoner of war camp, on a holiday she had never celebrated, placed before her as casually as if chocolate were ordinary, as if sweetness were available, as if the world had not been stripped of everything good and replaced with hunger and darkness and lies. Renate broke first. She stood so abruptly that her chair fell backward, clattering against the floor with a sound that cracked the silence like a gunshot. "Greta!" The name came out as a whisper, then louder. "Greta!" Her voice rose, cracking, breaking open. "My sister never tasted chocolate. She was 6 years old and she died, and she never tasted chocolate." She was screaming now in German, the words pouring out like blood from a wound that had never healed. "They told us the enemy was starving. They told us everyone was sacrificing. They told us our children were dying for a reason." Her whole body was shaking. And it was lies. All of it was lies. Greta died for nothing. The dam broke across the entire room. Women began to cry, not gentle tears, not dignified weeping, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond the reach of military discipline or social convention. Hildegard sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders heaving. The composed nurse who had maintained control through every horror of the past months. She was crying like a child who had lost everything. Other women had slid from their chairs to the floor, curled into themselves, keening. Some pounded their fists against the tables. Some simply sat frozen, staring at the cakes with expressions of horror and wonder and devastation. The sound was unbearable, not the polite sniffling of momentary emotion, the raw animal sound of belief dying, of faith collapsing, of everything they had sacrificed for being revealed in 3 layers of chocolate as unnecessary suffering inflicted by leaders who had lied. Major Whitfield stood near the door, watching. She had expected surprise, perhaps pleasure, perhaps suspicion that the cakes were poisoned or drugged. She had not expected this collective breakdown, this tsunami of grief disguised as gratitude. She looked at Bridget Callahan, who stood near the kitchen entrance with tears running down her own weathered face. The cook met her eyes and shook her head slowly. She understood. This wasn't about the cake itself. This was about what the cake represented. Every woman in this room had been told that America was suffering, that the enemy was desperate, that Germany's sacrifices were necessary because everyone was equally deprived. The chocolate cake was proof that they had been lied to about everything. Private Delmar Hutchins stood at his post near the wall, watching. He was 22 years old. He had processed hundreds of prisoners. He thought he understood what war did to people. He had been wrong. He watched Renata Vollmer, the woman with the burning eyes, whose paperwork he had processed on their first day, collapse against Liesl Brenner, the 2 of them holding each other while their bodies shook with sobs. He watched Hildegard Steinhoff, the composed nurse, reach out and touch the chocolate frosting with one trembling finger, then bring that finger to her lips and taste it, and then begin to cry harder than before. He watched 54 women fall apart over chocolate cake. And he understood, finally, what this war had really done, not just to soldiers, not just to cities and economies and military positions, to people, to families, to children who had starved while the enemy had chocolate for baking. He would carry this moment for the rest of his life. He would never forget the sound of 54 women weeping. Later that night, in Barrack 7, the women lay awake in darkness. No one pretended to sleep. The chocolate cake sat in their stomachs. Most of them had eaten at least a few bites, unable to resist despite everything. But its true weight was in their minds. The wood stove crackled. The November wind moved through bare trees outside. The distant sounds of the American camp continued, guards changing shifts, vehicles moving, the ordinary operations of a military installation. Ordinary for them, impossible for Germany. "I want to ask you something," Liesl said into the darkness. Silence, waiting. The rumors, the ones we heard before we were captured, about the camps in the east, about what happens to Jews and Poles, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Hildegard's voice came from across the room. "I know what you're asking." More silence. "When I worked at the hospital in Munich, there were patients who came to us. Special patients, they were called. We were never told their names. We were never told where they came from." Her voice was flat. The voice of someone testifying to things they wished they had not seen. They were different. Some of them were disabled, some were elderly. Some were simply not what the government wanted German citizens to be. A long pause. We were told to care for them until they were transferred. The The transfers always happened at night. They went to a facility outside the city. We were told it was a rehabilitation center. Liesel heard Hildegard's breath shake. None of them ever came back. And we were told not to ask questions. Asking questions was unpatriotic. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Renate spoke, her voice hard. If they lied about the food, they lied about other things too. The camps, Liesel said. The labor camps in the east. What if they're not labor camps? What if the rumors are true? Hildegard's voice cracked. What if everything we heard, everything we were told was enemy propaganda? What if it was real? The question hung in the darkness like smoke. No one answered. Because they all knew, with a certainty that felt like drowning, that the answer was probably yes. If the government had lied about American scarcity, they had lied about everything else. If they had let children starve while the enemy had chocolate, they were capable of anything. If the chocolate cake was real, then the camps were probably real too. Liesel stared at the ceiling she could not see. "When will we know?" she whispered. "When will we find out the truth?" "Soon," Hildegard said. "The Allies are advancing. They'll find whatever there is to find." And then what? No one answered, because no one knew what came after the truth. What came after discovering that everything you had served, everything you had believed in, everything you had sacrificed for, was not just wrong, but monstrous. The chocolate cake had been sweet, but the truth it pointed toward was bitter beyond imagining. And it was coming. January 29th, 1945. The first reports arrived at Camp Stonehurst in a brown envelope marked "Confidential." Major Constance Whitfield sat alone in her office, the winter light flat and grey through the window, and read what the Soviet forces had discovered as they liberated the camp at Auschwitz 2 days earlier. The name had appeared before in intelligence reports, referenced obliquely in intercepted communications, mentioned by refugees who had escaped from occupied Poland. But the scale of what it represented had remained unclear until now. She read the descriptions. Gas chambers designed to kill thousands per day, disguised as shower facilities. Crematoriums with industrial capacity, their chimneys cold now but still stained with the residue of years of continuous operation. Warehouses filled with belongings, shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, human hair, sorted and catalogued with the same efficiency that Germans brought to any industrial process. She read the numbers. Preliminary estimates of the dead, counts that would be revised upward in the coming months as the full scope became clear. Numbers so large they ceased to have meaning, statistics instead of human beings, mathematics instead of mothers and fathers and children. She read the testimonies. Survivors, a handful, emaciated and traumatized, describing what they had witnessed. Soviet soldiers, hardened veterans who had seen Stalingrad, describing what they had found. Military photographers documenting everything because the truth was too enormous, too terrible, to be believed without evidence. Major Whitfield set the papers down. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. But something inside her had changed. Some understanding of human capacity for evil that she had thought she possessed, having lived through one world war and most of another, revealed itself to be inadequate. This was something new. This was something that required new vocabulary, new categories, new frameworks for comprehension, and she was going to have to decide what to tell the women in Barrack 7. She spent 2 days wrestling with that decision. She could keep the information contained. The German women were prisoners, not entitled to news from the outside world. She could allow them to remain in ignorance, at least until the war ended and the full truth became impossible to hide. She could spare them, for a few more months, the knowledge that would destroy whatever remained of their national identity. But Major Whitfield had been raised on a dairy farm in Massachusetts by parents who believed that truth was sacred even when it was painful, especially when it was painful. Comfortable lies are just slow poison, her father had said once. Truth may hurt, but at least it heals clean. And there was something else. These women had already tasted truth in the form of chocolate cake. They had already learned that their government had lied about American scarcity. That discovery had shattered something in them. She had watched it happen, had heard the sound of 54 women weeping over chocolate frosting. Perhaps they deserved to know the rest. Perhaps they had earned the right to the full truth rather than the partial truth that protected no one. February 1st, 1945. She posted the newspaper articles on the bulletin board in the common area. No announcement, no gathering, simply the articles and photographs, dated and sourced, available for anyone who chose to read them. Soviet forces liberate Auschwitz. Death camp. Systematic murder of millions, documented gas chambers used for mass executions. Photographs that she had reviewed carefully before posting, selecting images that documented the horror without being gratuitously graphic. Skeletal survivors behind barbed wire. The gates of the camp. Ovens that needed no explanation. The American soldiers read them first, clustering around the board during their breaks, their faces cycling through shock, anger, grim satisfaction that the enemy they were fighting truly deserved defeat. The German women avoided the board. They had seen the Americans gathering, had sensed the change in atmosphere, the weight of something heavy and unspoken that had settled over the camp. They knew something terrible was waiting for them. They were afraid to find out what it was. Liesl approached the board alone, early in the morning on February 3rd. She had been avoiding it for 2 days, finding reasons to look elsewhere, to be occupied with kitchen duties, to not walk past that section of the common area. But avoidance was a kind of cowardice, and she had decided, lying awake the previous night, listening to the breathing of women who were also not sleeping, that she was done being a coward. Whatever waited on that board, she would face it. The photographs hit her first. Bodies, piles of bodies, stacked like lumber, limbs tangled together in configurations that no living human would tolerate. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, alive but barely, their eyes enormous in faces that had been reduced to skull and skin, their bodies showing every bone. Ovens, industrial ovens, their purpose unmistakable, mountains of shoes, children's shoes. Liesl's vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the bulletin board, her knuckles white, fighting to remain upright. Then she read the articles. The words swam before her eyes, but she forced herself to read them. Gas chambers, designed as showers, pumping poison instead of water. Crematoriums, operating continuously, burning bodies faster than they could be buried. Selection, the process of deciding who would work and who would die immediately upon arrival. And the numbers, the estimates of the dead. 1 million at Auschwitz alone, more at other camps, camps with names she was only now learning. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek. 6 million Jews across all of occupied Europe. Millions more, Poles, Soviets, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, anyone the Reich had designated as unworthy of life. Liesl's legs gave out. She slid down the wall, her back scraping against rough wood, until she sat on the cold floor with her knees drawn up to her chest. We served this. The thought was a knife, twisting in her gut. We wore the uniform, we sent the radio transmissions, we filed the reports, we were part of the machine, and the machine was built for murder. She thought of all the messages she had transmitted during her service. Military communications, supply requests, troop movements, ordinary wartime traffic, or so she had believed. How many of those messages had facilitated this? How many transports had been scheduled? How many supplies requisitioned? How many orders transmitted through her hands, through her equipment, through her service to keep these camps running? She didn't know. She would never know. And that uncertainty was its own form of torture. Other women found her there as the morning progressed. One by one, they came to the bulletin board. One by one, they read. One by one, They collapsed. Hildegard read the descriptions of medical experiments and pressed her hand over her mouth, barely making it to the waste bin before she vomited. Renate read the accounts of children being sent directly to the gas chambers and began to laugh, a terrible sound, broken and wrong, before the laughter turned to screaming. By noon, every woman in Barracks 7 had seen the board. The barracks had become a landscape of grief. Some sat alone, staring at nothing, their minds unable to process what they had learned. Others clustered together, holding each other, speaking in rapid German that fragmented into sobs. Some prayed, some cursed, some did both, their words a jumbled mixture of supplication and blasphemy, and some, a few, simply lay in their bunks with their faces turned to the wall, silent and still, gone to some internal place that no one else could reach. That evening, Liesl found Renate standing outside the barracks, staring at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene given what they had learned. "They took the food from our children," Renate said without turning around, "to feed the guards at those camps." Her voice was flat, empty. The rage that had burned in her since Liesl had known her seemed to have burned out entirely, leaving only ash. They let Greta starve so they could pay soldiers to operate gas chambers. Every gram of bread that didn't reach my sister's mouth went somewhere else. Now I know where. Liesl stood beside her, not touching, just present. "I thought the worst thing was that they lied about the food," Renate continued. "That was what I couldn't forgive, that our children died of hunger while the enemy baked chocolate cake." She finally turned to look at Liesl. "But that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing is that they let our children starve to fund genocide. They made us choose between feeding our families and feeding their murder factories. And they told us it was sacrifice. They told us it was patriotism. They told us we were suffering for something noble." Tears were running down her face, but her voice remained flat. "Greta died for this. My 6-year-old sister starved to death so the Reich could afford to gas Jewish children." She turned back to the sunset. "How do you live with that? How does anyone live with that?" Liesl had no answer. She wasn't sure there was one. February gave way to March. The war in Europe was ending. Everyone knew it, even without official announcements. The news that filtered through painted a picture of inevitable collapse. German armies retreating on all fronts, cities falling, the Reich shrinking daily. But in Barracks 7, a different kind of ending was taking place. The women who had arrived in October, starving, defeated, but still possessing some coherent sense of themselves and their place in the world, were gone. In their place were women who had been fundamentally broken and were now, slowly, beginning to reassemble themselves into something new. Liesl still worked in the kitchen. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. The rhythm of cooking, the tangible results of measuring and mixing and baking, these provided structure when everything else had collapsed. Bridget Callahan noticed the change in her. She noticed the dark circles under Liesl's eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She noticed the way the young woman threw herself into work with desperate intensity, as if staying busy could keep the thoughts at bay. She noticed the moments when Liesl would stop mid-task, staring at nothing, lost in some internal landscape of grief and guilt. One morning in late March, Bridget sat down beside Liesl during a break between meal preparations. "You're not sleeping," she said. It wasn't a question. Liesl shook her head. "When I close my eyes, I see the photographs, the bodies, the shoes." Her voice was barely audible. "And I wonder which messages I sent that helped make that happen, which supply requests I transmitted, which troop movements I reported." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother used to say something after she told me about the famine." Her voice was soft. "She said the hardest part wasn't the hunger itself. It was the guilt of surviving." Liesl looked up. She had 6 siblings, 4 of them died, and she lived with that for 83 years, the question of why she was the one who got on the boat, why she was the one who made it to America while her brothers and sisters went into mass graves. Bridget's weathered hands folded on the table. She never found an answer. I don't think there is one, but she found something else. She found a way to live that honored the ones who didn't make it. How? By making things better for other people, by feeding those who were hungry, by refusing to let suffering be meaningless. Bridget looked at her steadily. She couldn't bring her siblings back, but she could make sure their deaths taught her something about kindness, about generosity, about the importance of remembering. I don't know how to do that, Liesl said. I don't know how to make any of this mean something. Bridget nodded slowly. That's where cooking comes in. Cooking? When you've been through what you've been through, what my grandmother went through, what you're going through now, something changes in how you approach food. You start measuring everything, hoarding, saving scraps, rationing, even when rationing isn't necessary. She leaned forward. I want to teach you something different. I want to teach you to cook with abundance. Liesl frowned. I don't understand. Abundance isn't about having plenty. It's about trusting that there will be enough. It's about measuring ingredients generously, not fearfully. It's about approaching the kitchen, approaching life, with faith instead of anxiety. She stood, moving toward the workspace. My grandmother taught me this after she told me about the famine. She said it was the hardest thing she ever learned and the most important. How to cook without fear. How to share without counting. How to live as if there will be more tomorrow. She looked back at Liesl. I want to teach you, not just recipes, though there will be recipes. I want to teach you how to believe in plenty again. And so Bridget taught her, day by day, hour by hour, in the industrial kitchen of Camp Stonehurst. She taught techniques, how to cream butter and sugar until light and fluffy, how to fold beaten egg whites without losing their air, how to test cake doneness by touch. But more importantly, she taught philosophy. Don't measure the flour like it's precious, Bridget would say, watching Liesl carefully level each cup. Measure it like there's plenty, because there is plenty. That's what peace looks like. Liesl practiced. She made bread using flour without rationing it, kneading dough with movements that grew more confident over time. She made soup, adding vegetables generously instead of stretching thin portions. She made, eventually, chocolate cake. But the first cake Liesl baked alone was imperfect. Lopsided, with one layer slightly thinner than the others, over-frosted in places, under-frosted in others. The chocolate was slightly grainy where she hadn't mixed it long enough. But it was chocolate cake, real chocolate cake, made with her own hands, from ingredients that she had once believed did not exist in enemy territory. She stood looking at it for a long time in the empty kitchen, late at night, after everyone else had gone. Then she cut a slice, sat down at the prep table and ate it. The sweetness flooded her mouth, rich and dark and impossibly present, and for the first time since reading about Auschwitz, she cried. Not tears of grief, though grief was present, tears of something else, something that might eventually become hope. The war in Europe ended on May the 8th, 1945. VE Day. The American soldiers at Camp Stonehurst celebrated with whatever they could find. Hoarded bottles of whiskey, extra rations, a sense of relief that the fighting was finally over. The German women did not celebrate. For them, the end of the war was not victory. It was not even relief. It was simply the beginning of a different kind of uncertainty. What would happen to them now? Where would they go? What was left of the country they had served? In the weeks that followed, the women of Barrack 7 began to think about the future. Hildegard came to Liesl one evening in late May, her face set with determination. I've made a decision. Liesl looked up from the letter she was writing. Her third attempt at a message to her mother, trying to find words for things that had no words. I want to work with refugees, Hildegard said. After we're released, wherever they send us, I want to use my nursing training to help displaced persons." "Why?" Hildegard sat on the edge of Liesel's bunk. "Because I was a nurse who didn't ask questions. I treated patients who were sent away to die, and I chose not to see what was happening. I can't undo that, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to heal instead of harm." Her eyes were steady, clear in a way they hadn't been for months. "The war broke something in all of us. But broken things can be remade, maybe not the same as before, but into something new, something that serves life instead of death." Renate's decision was different. "I'm going back to Germany," she told Liesel, her voice hard with purpose. "When they let us go, when travel is possible again, I'm going back." "To do what?" "To teach." Renate's jaw tightened. Someone has to tell the truth about what happened. Someone has to make sure the next generation knows about the camps, knows about the lies, knows about children who starved while the government funded murder. That will be difficult. People won't want to hear it. I don't care what they want to hear. They need to hear the truth. She looked out the window at the camp that had been her home for 8 months. Greta deserves that much. All the children who died deserve someone who won't let the truth be buried with them. Liesel thought about these conversations for days. Hildegard would heal. Renate would teach. What would she do? The answer came slowly, assembled from fragments over weeks of kitchen work and late-night thinking. She would stay. If they would let her, if the chaos of the post-war world permitted such things, she would stay in America. Not because she wanted to escape Germany, though escape had its appeal. Not because she feared what she would find if she went back, though that fear was real, but because something had begun in this kitchen, under Bridget Callahan's patient instruction, that she wanted to continue. She had learned to bake with abundance. She had learned to trust that there would be enough. She had learned that food could be more than survival, that it could be healing, communion, an act of faith made tangible. She wanted to build something with those lessons. And she wanted to do it here, in the country that had shown her truth through chocolate cake. There was something else, too. Private Delmar Hutchins had been transferred to a different section of the camp in March, but she still saw him occasionally in the mess hall, crossing the compound, doing the ordinary work of a military installation. He always nodded when they passed. Sometimes he smiled. Nothing improper had happened between them. Nothing could happen given the circumstances. But something existed, a recognition, a possibility, a seed that might grow if given the chance. She did not know if it would grow. She did not know if she would be permitted to stay, or if he would still be interested once she was no longer a prisoner. But she knew what she wanted, and wanting, she had learned, was its own form of hope. Autumn 1964. Princeton, New Jersey. The afternoon sun slanted through windows that Liesel Hutchins had cleaned that morning, illuminating display cases filled with pastries, breads, and cakes that she had baked before dawn. The sign above the door read "Brenner's Fine Baking" in neat gold letters. Beneath it, in smaller script, established 1952. She was 46 years old now. Her hair, once dark, showed grey at the temples. Her face carried the lines of years lived fully, laugh lines around her eyes from a marriage that had somehow worked, worry lines across her forehead from raising 3 children in a country that was still sometimes strange. She weighed 134 pounds, a healthy weight maintained by regular meals and the physical work of running a bakery for 12 years. A healthy weight, a weight that represented everything she had learned about trusting plenty. The bell above the door chimed. A young man entered, mid-20s, carrying a reporter's notebook, looking around the shop with the slightly nervous energy of someone on assignment. "Mrs. Hutchins, I'm William Patterson from the Princeton Courier. We spoke on the phone about the Immigrant Business Owner series." Liesel smiled and wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, of course, please, sit down. Would you like coffee? Something to eat? Coffee would be wonderful, and maybe he looked at the display case. Is that chocolate layer cake? My specialty. I'd love a slice if that's not too much trouble. No trouble at all. She cut a generous piece, the way Bridget had taught her, generous, trusting, and poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug. They sat at one of the small tables she had added when the bakery expanded in 1958. The interview began with simple questions: where she was from, when she had arrived in America, how she had learned to bake. Liesel answered them carefully, watching the young reporter write in his notebook, watching his face for reactions. Then he asked, "Your bakery specializes in German pastries, but your chocolate layer cake is what you're famous for, and that's a very American dessert. Can you tell me about that choice?" Liesel was quiet for a moment. "That cake saved my life." The reporter's pen stopped moving. "Not literally," she clarified, "but by the time I tasted it, I wasn't dying of hunger anymore. But it saved something else, something that had died during the war years." "What do you mean?" She looked at him, this young American who had probably never known real hunger, who probably thought rationing meant inconvenience rather than death, and made a decision. She would tell him the truth. Not all of it. Some things were too private, too terrible, too difficult to compress into a newspaper article. But enough. "I came to America as a prisoner of war," she said. His eyebrows rose. "I was captured in France in 1944 and spent the rest of the war at Camp Stonehurst, about 40 miles from here. I was a radio operator for the German military." She watched him process this information, the shift in his perception of her, from cheerful baker to something more complicated. "When I arrived at that camp, I weighed 89 pounds. I had not seen white bread in 2 years. I had not tasted real butter since 1942. I had been told that Americans were starving, that everyone in the world was suffering equally, that our hunger was shared." She paused. "The first meal they served us had white bread, real bread, made from real flour, and butter and coffee with cream. I stood in that mess hall and watched 54 women who had been starving for years, weep over bread and butter." The reporter was writing furiously now. "Then came Thanksgiving, a holiday I had never heard of. They served us turkey and mashed potatoes and all the things that Americans eat on that day." She looked toward the display case, at the chocolate cakes waiting for customers. "And then they brought out chocolate cake. 3-layer cakes made with real chocolate and real sugar and real butter, enough for everyone, and we—" Her voice caught. "We broke apart, we wept, we screamed, not because the cake was good, though it was, but because it proved that everything we had believed was a lie." She met the young reporter's eyes. "We had been told the enemy was starving. Meanwhile, they were baking chocolate cake for prisoners. We had been told our children's hunger was necessary sacrifice. Meanwhile, the enemy had 50 pounds of chocolate per month for baking." She shook her head. "That cake showed us the truth. And the truth was that our suffering had been unnecessary. Our children had died for nothing." The reporter was quiet for a long moment. He searched for words. "That's an incredible story." "It's a terrible story," Liesel corrected gently, "but it's also a story about how truth can set you free, even when it destroys everything you believed." She stood, moving to refill his coffee. "The woman who baked that cake, her name was Bridget Callahan. She became my teacher. She taught me to bake. More importantly, she taught me to bake with abundance, with faith that there would be enough." What does that mean? It means cooking without fear, measuring generously instead of hoarding, trusting that tomorrow's ingredients will be there. She smiled. Her grandmother survived the Irish famine. She understood what starvation does to people, how it changes the way you think, how it makes you ration, even when rationing isn't necessary. She set the coffee pot down. She taught me to unlearn that, to believe in plenty again, and when she died in 1972, she's passed away? Yes, peacefully in her sleep at 73. Liesel's voice softened. She left me her recipe collection, including the chocolate cake. She nodded toward the display case. Every cake I bake is her recipe, and every cake is a kind of prayer. The interview lasted another hour. Liesel told the reporter about Hildegard, who had worked with refugees for 15 years before cancer took her in 1963. Her funeral had been attended by dozens of people she had helped, displaced persons from across Europe, all testifying to her kindness. She told him about Renate, who had returned to Germany as promised and now taught history at a school in Stuttgart. Her letters arrived every Christmas, full of difficulty but also determination. She told him about marrying Delmar in 1948 after she received permission to stay in America, about opening the bakery in 1952 with savings he had accumulated during his military service, about raising 3 children who had never known hunger, who complained when dinner was late, who had no idea what a miracle that complaint represented. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him about the nightmares that still came sometimes, the photographs from Auschwitz, the sound of women weeping over chocolate cake, the weight of guilt for having served, however unknowingly, a regime that built murder into an industry. Some things were not for newspapers. Some things were only for the dark hours before dawn, when she lay awake beside her sleeping husband and wondered, still, after 20 years, whether she had done enough to atone for the uniform she had worn. After the reporter left, Liesel stood alone in her bakery. The afternoon light had faded. Soon she would need to begin preparations for tomorrow, the endless cycle of measuring and mixing and baking that had become her life. But for now, she simply stood, looking at the chocolate cakes in the display case. She thought about the 54 women who had arrived at Camp Stonehurst in October 1944. Starving, defeated, certain of cruelty. She thought about the bread that had tasted like miracles, the butter that had proved the propaganda false, the chocolate cake that had demolished an empire of lies. She went to the small office behind the kitchen where she kept her most precious possessions. In a wooden box on the top shelf sat a single sheet of paper, yellowed now with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. Bridget's handwriting. The recipe for chocolate layer cake. Beneath the recipe, in different ink, added sometime in the late 1960s. For Liesel, I told you once that my grandmother taught me to cook with abundance. Now I'm teaching you, and someday you'll teach someone else. That's how survival works. We pass on what we've learned so that others don't have to learn it the hard way. Every cake is a chance to remind someone that sweetness exists. Every slice is a small act of faith. Bake generously, trust plenty, and never forget what it cost to learn these things. Your friend always, Bridget. Liesel held the paper for a long moment. Then she returned it to the box, closed the lid, and went back to the kitchen. Tomorrow she would wake at 4 in the morning, as she did every day. She would measure flour and sugar and cocoa and butter, generously, trusting plenty. She would bake chocolate cake. And somewhere, someone would taste that cake and experience, perhaps without knowing why, a small reminder that sweetness still existed in the world. That was what the recipe had taught her. That was what Bridget had given her. That was what the chocolate cake, served to 54 starving women in a New Jersey prisoner of war camp on Thanksgiving Day 1944, had ultimately meant. Not just sweetness, truth. The truth that suffering was not equally shared, the truth that governments lied and children died and nothing was as it seemed. But also this truth that kindness existed even in war, that enemies could be human, that the proper response to learning terrible things was not despair, but transformation. The article appeared in the Princeton Courier, 2 weeks later. It generated more mail than any human interest story the paper had published in years. Letters from veterans who remembered the POW camps. Letters from German immigrants who recognized themselves in Liesel's story. Letters from people who had never thought about what the war had meant for the enemy's civilians. Liesel answered every one. Brenner's fine baking continued to operate until 1994, when Liesel finally retired at the age of 76. By then, her daughter had learned the recipes. Her granddaughter was learning them too. The chocolate layer cake remained the specialty of the house. Liesel Brenner Hutchins died peacefully in her sleep on March 3, 1998. She was 80 years old. Her obituary in the Princeton Courier noted that she was survived by her husband Delmar, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. It mentioned her bakery, it mentioned her German heritage. It did not mention that she had arrived in America as a prisoner of war. It did not mention the chocolate cake. Some truths, her family decided, were too complex for obituaries. But in the archives of the National Museum of American History, among the collections documenting World War II prisoner of war experiences, there exists a recipe card. It was donated in 1998 by the Hutchins family, along with a brief account of its significance. The card is written in 2 hands, the original in firm, practical script, a later edition in more delicate handwriting. It is labeled Chocolate Layer Cake, Callahan/Brenner. Beneath the recipe, someone has written, "This cake was first served to German POWs at Camp Stonehurst, New Jersey, Thanksgiving 1944. It was made as an act of kindness. It became an act of truth." The recipe remains available to researchers and historians. Occasionally, someone will read the accompanying documentation and then go home and bake the cake. Most of them don't know why they're crying when they taste it. But somewhere, somehow, the message gets through. Sweetness exists, truth matters, and chocolate